He wakes up not in a soft bed, but on a damp bed of straw, the wooden beams above his head and the soot and mold stains on the walls. The door stinks of cold, and the remains of the hearth crackle in the corner. All around, darkness and silence, broken only by the coughing of a neighbor in the hut. No electricity, no running water, no first aid kit. Only my own hands, a tired body, and a world in which man is not the master, but a victim of time. England of the Dark Ages did not forgive weakness. Sickness could take a day to catch up with you, and injury could be a death sentence. Food was hard to come by, and even that could be poisonous. The raiders left no women, no children, no hope. Every night was a test, every morning a victory. War, hunger, cold, and superstition were not isolated phenomena, but everyday life. The question remains, could a man born in safety and comfort survive the harsh, ruthless reality of the Dark Ages? The answer is in the details, and they are close at hand. In the Dark Ages of England, there were no corner shops and no surplus. To eat, you had to go to the woods, the river, or the field. That was the whole supermarket. Every tree, every bush could be the difference between life and starvation. The Anglo-Saxons knew exactly when wild garlic was blooming, where to find nuts or where burdock root was hidden under the snow. In spring, they gathered nettles to make thick soup. In the fall, they dried berries, and in winter, they shoveled moss if there was nothing to eat. Fish were caught in different ways, with nets, spits, bone hooks, and sometimes simply by hand in murky water. Frogs, snails, and water beetles were not a delicacy, but a source of protein. Even dead fish could not be thrown away, but smoked and left for a rainy day. The rich had better food, with pigs, poultry, and sometimes meat, but they didn't always have enough. Servants and peasants made a thick chowder of turnips, barley, and onions, all boiled in one pot until soft. Sometimes blood, dried skin, or even bones ground into powder were added. Many people made flour from acorns despite their bitterness. They soaked them for several days beforehand. They stored everything in underground pits where it was cool and not so damp. A spoilage of supplies could mean the death of the whole village. Rats were feared as much as wolves. Famine came often because of bad harvests, invasions, unsuccessful tithe collection. In such times, they ate everything: tree bark, skins, boiled shoes. There were cases of cannibalism, and this is not a legend, but a chronicled reality. Historians say that even wealthy homes could not feed for more than a month without fresh receipts, and the poor sometimes prayed not for the salvation of their souls, but for an extra bowl of chowder. To go through the winter without food was to become a shadow, gaunt and gutless. Even children from the age of 5 learned to distinguish poisonous berries from edible ones. A mistake could kill an entire family. If the father did not return from hunting, the mother shared the leftovers of last night's potion, hoping there would be enough to last until dawn. The world outside the cabin door was full of smells, but not always edible. Meat was a luxury, an occasion, a feast. One killed boar could feed a village for a week, but more often we had to eat stewed nettles and rare crumbs of oats. Food was used to make everything: clothes, tools, bait. Every grain was an investment in survival. And here is the main question. Would a man from the 21st century be able to live at least a week relying only on land and water? Would he know where to look for food, or would he die in the forest, unable to distinguish cloudberries from wolfberries? Life in the Dark Ages began with the question, what to eat today? And often there was simply no answer. In the Dark Ages, clothing was not a matter of taste or fashion, it was a matter of survival. There were no synthetics, no water-repellent fabrics, no insulation, only coarse wool, uncured leather, and rare pieces of linen. Everything that was worn was handmade, from what could be bartered, dressed, collected, or inherited. Woolen tunics, undyed, thick and scratchy, were sewn to withstand wind and moisture. Sheepskin or goatskin cloaks were worn over them, often not completely cleaned of grease, unpleasant but warm. No button fastenings. They used ties, bone buckles, or just ropes. In northern England, where the winter wind blows through even thick walls, clothes decided who woke up in the morning and who froze during the night. They slept without undressing, and sometimes even with their shoes on, otherwise their feet would not warm up in the morning. Children were wrapped in rags, mothers in skins, and old people often died in the same clothes they were born in. Women wore knives on their belts, not for beauty, but to cut cloth or to free a frozen knot. Women wore knives on their belts, not for beauty, but to cut cloth or to free themselves from a frozen knot. Men dried their wet clothes by the fire, risking burning their only tunic. Footwear was a luxury. More often, they wore leather wrappings wrapped in rags and held on by belts. In the mud and damp, they got wet instantly, but there was no other choice. To avoid frostbite, people sewed inner liners made of straw or fur, which did not always help. Headgear was mandatory: hoods, caps, wrappings, anything that kept warm. Losing a headdress meant serious danger, especially at night. Warriors wrapped themselves in cloaks, using them as sleeping bags, and commoners wrapped themselves in old sacks. Historians have found ample evidence for the existence of layered clothing. Archaeological finds at York, Lindisfarne, and Hedaboo confirm this. One layer on the naked body, a second for warmth, a third for protection from the wind. All heavy and uncomfortable, but you couldn't survive without it. The smell of clothes was a separate topic. They were not washed, only dried and dusted. It smelled of sweat, smoke, grease, and earth, the smell of life. But better a stinking tunic than a naked body under a winter sky. Things were handed down from generation to generation, patched, shabby, but priceless. Fabric was expensive, and even rags were not thrown away. They were used to make shoe pads or stuffed pillows. A small sack of cloth could be exchanged for food or salt. Clothing in those centuries was not what one wore, but whether one could survive. And the main question was, would a person from today's time be able to cope with clothes that cannot be washed, renewed, or bought again? Would he complain about the inconvenience, or would he just be glad he was still alive? In the Dark Ages, clothes did not save from the cold, but without them, man became nothing, prey to wind, rain, and his own fragility. In the Middle Ages, the concepts of hygiene and sanitation were very different from what they are today, and often did not exist in the usual sense. The lack of soap and clean water turned any castle or village into a breeding ground for disease, where infections spread with terrifying speed and ease. People did not understand how diseases were transmitted, so even a simple scratch could be fatal if dirt and parasites got into the wound. Lice, fleas, and other blood-sucking insects lived close to humans, penetrating clothing and hair, causing constant itching and inflammation, which could not be eliminated without special medicines. Plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, and other diseases killed hundreds or thousands of people, sometimes wiping out entire settlements in a matter of weeks. Medieval chronicles describe entire families dying without leaving their homes because the infection was transmitted between loved ones without treatment. Drinking water was often taken from surface springs, rivers, and wells that were contaminated with sewage or animal corpses, exacerbating the spread of intestinal diseases and dysentery. Sanitary facilities were limited to night potties, which were often poured directly out of windows into the street, creating an ideal environment for bacteria to multiply and infections to spread. Many lived in constant dampness, leading to colds and chronic bronchitis, while the nighttime cold aggravated the sick and weak. Local witch doctors and herbalists were the only hope for many, but their methods were often based on superstition and limited knowledge, which did not always help and sometimes even aggravated the condition. Often herbs and decoctions were the only support for a weakened body, but they were powerless for serious infections. The simplest wounds could become infected, turning into purulent ulcers, leading to sepsis and death. Already in the 14th century, some monasteries tried to introduce elementary rules of hygiene: washing hands before eating and after going to the toilet, singling out the sick, disinfecting the premises. Nevertheless, such practices remained rare and spread very slowly, which could not stop the epidemics. Even more tragic was the fact that many people did not understand exactly how infection occurred, attributing diseases to the wrath of a god or a curse. In terms of survival, the constant presence of dirt, insects, and pathogenic germs made life in medieval England a test not only of physical strength, but also of psychological fortitude. One can only imagine what it was like to endure the constant itching from lice, fight coughs and fevers while doing hard work, and guarding their homes from enemies. The question that remains relevant for modern man is, could he endure this continuous pain and suffering without modern medicines and basic hygiene products? It was this reality, full of disease and fear of contagion, that shaped the daily lives of those who lived during the Dark Ages, making them appreciate every minute of peace and health. For many, survival meant not only avoiding the enemies outside, but also fighting the invisible enemy, the disease that lurked in every corner. And in this ruthless world, only the most resilient and adaptable could hope to see the next dawn, sleeping in a house made of mud and wood. Peasant huts in medieval England were rudimentary structures of wood and clay, often with thatched roofs to let in the wind and rain, which was the norm rather than the exception. Inside, the walls were covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung to keep the heat in, but it was hard to call it cozy. The space was cramped, damp, and cold. The earthen floor was often covered with straw or rags, but it was dangerous to walk barefoot on it because of dirt and small sharp objects. A hearth burned in the center of the house, the open flames of which gave some heat and light, but the smoke, which had no escape through the fireplace, filled the room and irritated the eyes and lungs. The smoke from the fire literally permeated the dwelling, causing people to cough and cry, but there was little choice. Fire was vital for cooking and defense against predators. We had to sleep in cramped quarters, often with pets that served to both keep us warm and create additional problems with odors and vermin. The drafts from gaps in the walls and doors penetrated even the most secluded corner, causing the bedspreads and clothes to quickly get wet and cold. Rats and mice were constant nocturnal neighbors, roaming freely around the dwelling in search of food, creating an additional source of anxiety and health hazards. To imagine sleeping in such conditions is to realize that the comfort and safety familiar today was then a luxury available to only a few. Population density and poor sanitary conditions contributed to the rapid spread of disease, as fleas, lice, and other parasites that cause constant itching and infections were easily spread in such crowded conditions. Artisans and peasants often did not have the ability to keep their homes clean in the modern sense, so dirt and dust accumulated on floors and walls, aggravating an already difficult situation. Many lived in constant fear of disease, rodents, and chalad, which was often the cause of death during harsh winters. Historical documents preserve descriptions that even small huts could serve as shelter during enemy raids. But inside the dwelling, there was a constant sense of threat and anxiety. For most peasants, night meant not rest, but a struggle against discomfort, illness, and fears. And in the morning, one had to go out again to the field or the craft shop, with no right to weakness. Whether modern man could survive in such a home, without modern conveniences and defenses, remains a question that forces us to rethink the value of simple things. These huts are symbols of the harsh life of medieval peasants, where home was both a refuge and a challenge, and where sleeping overnight became a struggle for survival. They bear the imprints of human resilience, daily efforts and habits that have evolved over centuries. And despite all the hardships, it was in such houses that the history of the common people was born, whose fates rarely reach the pages of chronicles, but it was they who created the foundation of medieval England. During the Middle Ages, weapons in the hands of the common man were an indispensable tool for survival, not just a means of warfare, because the forests and fields were swarming with wolves, bears, and other wild predators threatening life and livestock. In addition to beasts, bandits and brigands were a constant danger, raiding low-guarded villages and solitary farms, forcing the inhabitants to be constantly on guard and able to defend themselves quickly. People learned to make simple but effective traps, strengthen fences and gates, and build fences and watchtowers to minimize the risk of surprise attack. The weapon at hand, be it spear, bow, or sword, was used not only to fight in the field, but also to ward off predators and robbers, and often the choice of weapon determined the chances of escape in a critical situation. Historical chronicles mention cases when whole villages were repelled from raids thanks to organized cohorts and competent defense, but by no means always managed to avoid losses. Understanding how to properly fortify a castle, or at least one's own home, was a vital skill for anyone who wanted to stay alive. Fortress walls, moats, and gates were not just symbols of power, but real barriers between life and death, especially at night when an attack could begin suddenly, leaving no time to prepare. In addition, guard posts and night watches had to patrol the area continuously, and guard shifts were conducted with certain rituals and rigor to ensure that danger was not missed. The ability to react quickly to an alarm, to use the sounds of bells and signal lights correctly, sometimes decided the fate of the entire settlement. The danger of attack kept people in constant tension, and many lived with a perpetual fear of a surprise attack, which affected not only their physical but also their psychological state. Historical records tell of individual families hiding in the cellars and secret rooms of castles, while enemies or marauders raged outside the walls. Sophisticated signaling systems, such as lighted torches on towers, made it possible to alert neighboring fortifications and gather help. But in isolation, the chances of survival were greatly reduced. Knowledge and skills, which today seem outdated, were then necessary for everyone who wanted to keep themselves and their loved ones alive. Because nature and man outside the city are merciless and ruthless. Could modern man, accustomed to security and comfort, survive among these constant threats and learn to react lightning fast to danger? By answering this question, one can gain a deeper understanding of the true cost of the peace of mind and well-being that is taken for granted today. These harsh realities made it necessary to be attentive to detail. Knowing how to set traps, reinforce doors, and even keep in touch with neighbors so as not to be alone with danger. Despite all the difficulties, it was this knowledge and skills that ensured survival, turning the loner into part of a strong, mutually supportive community. It was the only way to resist not only human enemies, but also the forces of nature, which made life in those times a real challenge. During the Middle Ages, human life was a continuous test of body and spirit, and the daily routine often began long before dawn, when the first rays of the sun were just touching the horizon and night had not yet left the village. Rising at such hours meant the immediate start of work, cutting wood for the hearth, preparing tools and tending livestock, for without heat and food, no day could pass without labor. People knew no rest, and hard physical labor from dawn to dark was the only way to feed themselves and their families, forming not just a habit but a true standard of endurance. Plowing the land by hand, without modern plows, meant putting all the strength of one's arms and legs, and carrying heavy vessels of water from a well often required walking miles over rough terrain with no way to lighten the load. Repeating such actions day after day without mechanical assistance hardened the body, forcing the muscles to be tough and the spirit to be resilient. But to modern man, such an exertion might seem almost impossible. Historical chronicles describe how even young men broke under the weight of obligations, and only a few could endure such a rhythm for a long time without serious health consequences. Every inhabitant of a village or castle understood that survival depended directly on the ability to withstand physical exertion, and therefore raised children from an early age, teaching them to work and develop strength. Endurance was especially important in winter, when the short days required even more exertion to gather firewood and support the household. And a weak body often meant death from cold or starvation. Even in the armies of the time, soldiers had to be highly physically fit to endure long marches, battles, and night patrols, making physical endurance a key factor in survival. The lack of modern conveniences and technology meant that each day required a great deal of effort, and those who could not cope with this rhythm quickly became vulnerable to illness and injury. Life without today's familiar vehicles, pumps, and tools necessitated constant physical activity that seemed almost superhuman to modern man. Whether modern man, accustomed to comfort and a passive lifestyle, can adapt to such a regimen and endure daily challenges without fatigue or injury is a big question that begs the question of our true endurance. It's not just a question of strength. It's a test of the entire body system, which must be prepared for hours of hard work outdoors, often in harsh weather conditions. Endurance was then a guarantee not only of survival, but also of social status, for the weak could not fulfill their duties and lost the support of the community. Stories of peasants who walked dozens of kilometers every day, making fire and building houses, clearly show how important physical fitness was for medieval man. During the Dark Ages, the social structure was rigid and immutable. Man was either the master of the land and had power, or a servant, bound by obligation and without rights to his own opinion. The peasant, who made up the majority of the population, lived under the oppression of feudal lords and had no right to vote. His life and fate depended on the will of the landowner and local lord, and the laws often protected only the interests of the upper class. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and for the majority, life meant a constant struggle for survival under the oppression of an uncompromising hierarchy. The peasant could not expect justice or protection. His duties were clear and rigidly regulated: to plow the land, pay taxes, and obey any orders of the liege lord, regardless of their severity. Any show of discontent or attempted rebellion was punishable by death, often in the most gruesome way: hanging, which served as a deterrent and warning to all others. Historical chronicles are filled with tales of brutal reprisals against those who dared to raise their heads, and how ruthlessly the feudal lords suppressed the slightest manifestations of rebellion. Under such a social structure, a person was practically deprived of the right to personal opinion or independent action, which made life not only hard physically, but also psychologically overwhelming. The realization of one's own insignificance and total submission was the norm for millions of people who accepted this reality as inevitable. Can modern man, who has grown up in a culture of freedom and equality, withstand such pressure and subjugation? Or is an attempt at resistance doomed to tragedy? Many peasants lived with the constant fear of being accused of disobedience and punished without trial, and their families suffered the consequences of such accusations. At the same time, there were rare examples of courage and resistance in the Dark Ages. Peasant revolts, uprisings, and popular movements, although brutally suppressed, left a mark in history as a symbol of the struggle for freedom. However, the cost of such revolts was enormous, and more often than not, they ended in bloodshed and increased repression. The hierarchy of the Dark Ages was not only a social, but also a cultural code that was enshrined in customs, religion, and even language, shaping people's consciousness from childhood. The system of relations was built on unconditional subordination and respect for elders, and any violation of it was perceived as a challenge to the established order. Thus, it was important for the peasant not only to do his work, but also to accept his fate humbly, since an attempt to change fate could lead to death. In the Dark Ages, religion was an integral part of life, determining not only the schedule of the day, but also the way of thinking, explaining illness, failure, and any misfortune as punishment for sins. Faith strictly regulated behavior, and the church was the center of authority where every act was seen as under God's scrutiny and judgment in heaven. People lived in constant fear of hell, which was considered a real and terrible threat, and it was this fear that guided their actions and decisions, shaping everyday life. Prayers, rituals, and numerous superstitions were part of everyday life, because incomprehensible phenomena were explained by the influence of evil spirits or the anger of higher powers, and the atonement of sins became the main task of everyone. The lifestyle of many was determined not only by religious precepts, but also by the fear of being judged by the church or community, which could lead to isolation or punishment. After all, faith was not only a spiritual, but also a social tool of control, and abandoning it was often perceived as treason. Historical records show that even the simplest daily activities, from eating to sleeping, were accompanied by religious rituals and symbols, while holidays and fasts set the rhythm of the year and kept the collective consciousness alive. The church wielded enormous power, intervening in all areas of life, and the clergy often mediated between man and God, determining what was right and wrong. Would modern man, accustomed to freedom of choice, be able to live in such a system where every step and thought is in the crosshairs of divine judgment and human condemnation? Faith was also a support in difficult times. Epidemics, wars, and famine were seen as trials that could be passed through with faith and humility. But at the same time, religion also engendered a deep fear of the unknown, when incomprehensible diseases or natural disasters were perceived as punishment or demonic intervention. This fear not only limited personal freedom, but also created an atmosphere of constant tension and anxiety, which people coped with by turning to prayer and rituals. In medieval England, every crop failure meant not just hardship, but a real struggle for survival, when an entire year's food supply could be lost in a matter of months and families faced acute food shortages. Summer and fall supplies were quickly exhausted, And winter came with severe hardships when food became rare, and one had to make do with what was left, often turnips, withered bread, and even bones from which broth was boiled. Many starved, especially peasants and the lower classes, for whom the winter ration could be no more than 200 calories a day, a figure that barely provided a minimum level of survival. Historical chronicles describe cases when people literally sacrificed everything, including their household supplies and livestock, to somehow get through the hard season. But often it was not enough, and starvation came. Hunger led to weakened bodies, lowered immunity, and outbreaks of epidemics, because malnutrition undermined health, leaving people vulnerable. With such a shortage of food, physical activity decreased. Labor became almost impossible, which in turn created a vicious circle. Without food, the crop did not work. Without the crop, there was no food. The harsh reality dictated the need to forage for something, whether it was roots, wild herbs, or animals caught in traps. But these methods were unreliable and could not provide adequate food. Village conflicts over the distribution of scarce resources were frequent, and government measures to combat hunger were weak and ineffective. In such conditions, only those who had not only physical strength, but also the ability to adapt, find new sources of nourishment, and keep hope alive, survived. Historians' calculations show that the average medieval peasant's diet was meager and poor in proteins and vitamins, giving rise to a host of malnutrition-related diseases such as scurvy and avitaminosis. People accustomed to this lifestyle had much lower levels of energy and stamina than modern humans accustomed to a varied and balanced diet. The question remains, could a 21st century person, accustomed to abundance and convenience, survive in a world where one winter could be deadly? These realities created a constant tension and fear of the future, when even the simplest joys, a good harvest, a full box of grain, fresh bread, became cause for celebration. Impressive historical records show that it was hunger and its consequences that shaped the character and lifestyle of medieval man, making him value every crumb and fight to the last for the right to live. It was this endless struggle against hunger and scarcity of food that determined the rhythm and meaning of existence during the Dark Ages. In medieval homes, families lived incredibly close together, often in one small room where they slept closely together on straw bunks or just on the ground, without a hint of personal space. Food was served in one common bowl that was passed around, and each family member ate from it without having their own set of utensils or cutlery. All life was built on sharing. Personal belongings, clothing, even intimate moments. Everything was open and publicly available, which seems unthinkable to modern man, but seemed natural to the people of that time. The cramped conditions were exacerbated by the constant noise, smells of smoke and food, and the constant presence of pets that lived with the people inside the house, adding to the picture of a total lack of comfort. Only a very few could afford separate rooms or even separate houses, and peasants and artisans had to share their space with several generations of relatives. Such living conditions became a source of stress and psychological burden because there was no opportunity to be alone, not a moment of privacy. Historical chronicles tell us that even a night's rest did not bring peace. The walls were thin, the sounds of neighbors and pets did not stop, and in the cold season, everyone slept in the same room to warm themselves with each other's warmth. Psychologists note that constantly being in such close contact with other people formed a specific way of life, but also caused chronic tension and fatigue. In addition, close coexistence with pets that roamed around the house and slept right next to people created many problems. Cats and dogs protected the house from rodents, but they themselves became sources of odors and dirt. Sparrows and other birds, which often made their way inside through open windows and doors, also contributed to the chaos. In the absence of modern means of hygiene, such a neighborhood was not only inconvenient, but also dangerous. It was through pets that various diseases were spread. An important part of the domestic bustle was the constant drafts that came through gaps in the walls and roofs, making the atmosphere inside the houses damp and cold. Many families tried to huddle together to keep warm, but the cold winds and humidity still penetrated into the most secluded corners. This lifestyle was a strain on health, especially for children and the elderly, who became vulnerable to colds and other illnesses. In addition, the lack of privacy limited not only physical comfort, but also emotional well-being. People were forced to hide their feelings and thoughts to avoid conflict and judgment. The lack of opportunity to be alone interfered with recovery from a hard day's work, adding to fatigue and psychological strain. Social pressures in close-knit communities were especially palpable. Every action was observed and discussed, and mistakes could cost reputations or even lives. Interestingly, despite all these inconveniences, people found ways to preserve their dignity and human warmth. Family rituals, stories around the hearth, joint prayers and festivals helped to bond and create some sense of comfort. Often in such conditions, strong social bonds based on mutual help and support were formed, without which survival would be impossible. These communal traditions were becoming strongholds in a world where personal space was a luxury and comfort was an unattainable dream. Historical sources show that this complete openness and lack of privacy was the norm for medieval society. It is believed that personal space as a concept was practically absent. People perceived themselves as part of a whole, where everything was shared by everyone. A modern view of this way of life may seem harsh and even inhumane, but in that era, it was natural and customary. For them, living together was the key to survival, and they learned to accept crowdedness and noise as an integral part of everyday life. Thus, the complete lack of privacy and comfort in medieval houses is not just a domestic detail, but a reflection of a whole system of values and living conditions. These houses were not only places of recreation, but also the center of social life, where every moment is saturated with interactions and responsibilities. Knowing this helps us better understand how much our view of personal space and comfort has changed, and the price our ancestors had to pay for their daily existence. Life in the Dark Ages of England is not just a story of the past. It is a story of the incredible resilience and endurance of those who were able to survive the harshest of conditions. Every day was a struggle with cold, hunger, disease, and constant threat from the outside world. Reflecting on this, it is hard not to wonder, could modern man have passed through all this ordeal, preserving not only his body, but also his spirit? If you are fascinated by this kind of time travel and want to learn more about the lives, struggles, and mysteries of the past, subscribe to our channel. Together, we will open the doors to forgotten eras and feel the breath of history on ourselves. Don't miss the new videos. There are many amazing stories to come.